Check, check. That's okay, perfect. Thanks a lot. Hello, everyone. I wonder whether we should start. I know that we have 60 minutes today, and we want to make sure that we leave the room 5 to 1 as well. Speakers and other people may have sessions starting at once. So welcome to this event organized by the newly formed Open Research Working Group. I'm Dr. Andrea. I'm an assistant professor in the Anthropology department, and I've been a member of the Radical Open Access community for quite some time. I'm an editor and publisher of an open access journal working on Chinese politics, civil society, and labor. And it's a great pleasure for me to be chairing this event about the handling of qualitative data within our open science frameworks. So very happy of that. I have my chair notes, so I'll have to breeze through the notes so that we are all aware of what we are doing. The fire safety checkpoints is at Lincoln Inn Fields outside CKK for everyone to know, but I would be leading you in case of this unfortunate event of a fire. These are recorded events, so if you have to leave earlier or if you want to disseminate the content of this event, please do share it later on. I think it's recorded by ECO, yes? So it's a roundtable discussion today. I'll be mostly introducing the speakers, and then I might have my own question to ask, but what I'm here to do is to coordinate speakers' intervention. They're going to speak for 5 minutes, so that's how much time we do have, and so we will be having this discussion for around 35, 40 minutes, including Q&A from the audience, so please be forthcoming with questions, otherwise I will bombard these speakers with my own. So I need to introduce the series as well. As I said, this is an open research working group event. The group is made of researchers, academics, and professional services staff from across LSE, which is nice. I was saying that we tend to meet just people from our own bubble, and in fact, we are meeting across LSE is nice. And the aim of the group is to provide strategic direction for open research at the LSE and to foster a culture of open, transparent, inclusive, and collaborative research. So today we are looking as a topic, you'll see that there, making research on vulnerable or marginalized communities open. It's commonly said that research should be as open as possible and as closed as necessary, right? How open is research, it's possible for research to be when research is about vulnerable people. In my own work, I work with ethnic minorities, rural communities in Southwest China, and with climate activists. So I'm very curious about what speakers have to say about this, but this is a question that is very close to my own research agenda. Open data is usually something that is quite discussed in the STEM and in quants social sciences, in the sense of trying to provide data for reproducibility and replicability of studies. But what happens when these standards of replicability or openness are applied to the qualitative social sciences, especially when people are working with vulnerable communities, people who may have received political threat by being exposed, people who can actually be damaged by the publication of open scholarship and data on them. So how do we navigate these difficult questions will be the focus of this discussion. So without further ado, I want to introduce the speakers because I think they have much more interesting thing to say than myself. To my left is Dr. Joe Krishnakumar. Joe is a writer activist trained in participatory feminist and ethnographic research methods. They will be speaking about their own research, so I don't want to replicate things that are going to be said. Then I have on the other side, Dr. John Kunath is Associate Professor and Lifelong Engagement Lead at the International Inequality Institutes at the LSE. Dr. Polly Witzert is Case Associate Director and Associate Professor Research Fellow at the Center of Analysis and Social Exclusion at the LSE. And finally, Dr. Mirafora Kakuilodo is a postdoctoral research assistant in regulating emotion, strengthening adolescent resilience. RESTAR is the acronym. This is a research program at King's College, London. So I'll now hand it over to Joe, who may start today. They have 5 minutes. I will be checking the clock, I'm afraid. And over to you.
I have this mic, I think I feel like it's going to be a lot.
Yes, sure.
With all the mics. Hi, as Andrea said, I'm Joe. I'm an LSE fellow at the Anthropology department, and I'm going to try to cover as much work as possible within 5 minutes, but I am much better with questions, so please bring as many questions as you can for me and for all of us. I did my PhD at SOAS, if that is relevant, and to simplify what it is that I do, I split it into 4 parts that heavily overlap. Firstly, I work with sex working communities in South India to understand community-led practices of kin-making, care, and responses to marginality. So I heavily speak about violence in all my work, and that's one space that I do that. That's what I did my PhD in. And I was specifically looking at how sex workers cooperate with each other in heavily competitive spaces, and when there is so much violence around them, how do they make communities for themselves to not only center care but also activism, and just what is the work of activism within sex worker communities where the only work that is talked about is sexual labor, but that's often not the only work that is happening because they're activists as well. And I particularly look at this through a lens of gender, which intersects with caste and labor. Secondly, I work on a project called Transform. Please come and ask me more about that, which is a fully open access resource on understanding anti-trans violence in India, also extending to South Asia, because a lot of trans lives in South Asia sort of move along the same rhythms. But we are focusing on India because I am from India, I'm from South India specifically. Thirdly, I work on a digital visual project called Almari, and you can Google Almari and Transform if you want on your laptops. And Almari has been, as part of Almari, what I've been doing is I've been collecting and publishing stories of the existence or non-existence of South Asian closets, mostly because a lot of South Asians don't agree with the word closet. So what happens when we have to try and fit our experiences of queerness into Western neoliberal categories in post-colonial societies? What happens then? Do these spaces exist? Do they not exist? Instead of those spaces, does something else exist? So what does space making look like for South Asian queers and trans people? That's what I look at in the Almari project. I've been doing that for 5 years, and we have 150 Almaris. I wish I could show them to you, but you can also look at it online. And finally, the 4th part of my work is I'm a mental health practitioner and support worker. So I'm currently doing my diploma in narrative therapy, but I've been working as a mental health support worker for queer trans individuals in Chennai through online spaces that I run twice a month. So a lot of my work interlaps heavily with violence, response. How do people speak about violence? How do they embody violence? How do they also try to live through that violence? That's basically a lot of what I do. So we were sent a few questions about what are the barriers we face and what are some of the practices, open research practices that we do in our work, and what is the general philosophy. I've written a lot of very scribbly notes. If I can decipher them myself, I will tell you. But a few of the things that I wrote down is, in terms of practices, especially with regards to my PhD, as you can understand, the sex worker community I work with are mostly open, but there are lots of things that are closed within the community itself. So, for example, one example is during my PhD, all the sex worker leaders wanted their names mentioned in the PhD, and I had to listen to them. Because for them, they were like, we've spent years trying not to be a mass of women. So for you to anonymize us would be violent. So I had to actually name them as they wanted to be named. And so in that way, they had a very clear idea of how they wanted the research about them to be open. Another thing that I've done is I've recorded too many podcasts talking about my research. That sort of makes it more accessible, because not everybody wants to read an 80,000 to 100,000 word thesis. It can be a lot. what I'm also trying to do is record my thesis as I would have written it, because I think I'm a much better speaker than a writer. So I'm actually just recording my thesis so that people can listen to my thesis instead of having to read a thesis. I also try to publish a lot about positionality and ethics and methodology, because I feel like just talking about the structures instead of what ended up happening is very integral to me and my practice as an ethnographer and as a participatory researcher. And I think that has a lot of lines crossing over to open research as well. So really, why study sex work? Like, that's actually a thing that I have written about, because I did not see a lot of people talk about what are those trigger points in your mind that make you study what you study. I don't see that enough. So which is why I thought it was important for me to actually talk about why is this specific thing so interesting to me, and what makes it interesting? And is that exoticization? Is that othering? What are those feelings within me? And so that's what I've been trying to do. Some of the barriers I faced is just a lack of trust. Of course, there will be a lack of trust, because these are sex workers, and especially the workers that I've worked with are hyper-visibilized. Hyper-visibilized, so many anthropologists going to them, asking them what it is they do, why they do it, why they don't do something else, etc., etc. So a lot of my work with sex workers was just sitting and hanging out with them, which, as anthropologists, that's basically what we do. Because hanging out is also them, letting them do their research on us. So for me, open research and participatory research was just me also being let to be researched. For them to ask me questions about, they were for example, very taken aback that I'm a gay person on field, because yes, these are sex workers, but they couldn't wrap their head around the fact that I was married to a person who's not a man. That was just not something that was making sense to them. So I had to have those conversations with them as well. So for me to be open, that's the only way I was able to do the work that I did. One of the other barriers is I can't write anything without many board meetings, which I have sat in with the sex worker communities. So every piece that I write, recently I wrote a piece, it had to go through 4, I think, weeks of different people looking at how it is framed, etc., etc. And we can talk about gatekeeping. That might be one thing that is interesting to people in this room. And what that looks like and who my responsibility is to. Is it to research solely, or is it to people? How many minutes do I have? 30 seconds. 30 seconds, oh my god. Okay, my philosophy, I think I covered that. To make it as open as possible, communication should be involved, and I try to be as communicative as possible, so much so that I feel like I'm over-communicative, but I would prefer that. Over-communication is good. Under-communication, not as much.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Joe. I'll be moving to George Kunath, so I'll should I follow this order? How you prefer to do this? That's fine. So Polly, please, if you like.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. So, as you mentioned, I'm based at the LSE Centre for Analysis of Social Exclusion. So we look at different dimensions of multidimensional disadvantage and social policies, often but not exclusively in the UK context. And much of our research involves what are often referred to as vulnerable or marginalised groups, using mixed method approaches, both quant surveys and administrative data sets that can be very large, and also qualitative and participatory approaches. So we have a large body of research, including, for example, on homeless people, people with disabilities, socioeconomically disadvantaged people, children and other population subgroups. And my own research has involved, for example, research on Gypsy Traveller Roma experiences, on older disabled people, young carers in the UK, and also some subjects where participants are potentially at risk, so elder abuse and experiences of violence in older people in Peru, Kyrgyzstan and Mozambique, for example. So in terms of broader reflections on open data initiative, and I'm specifically thinking making data that we're gathering open access, the background really is that at CASE we have a long history of championing open research generally, So producing free and open access research reports and discussion papers, that's something we've done for 25 years, long before open access articles, and we release data tables wherever possible. And we are kind of mindful towards the shift towards open data as default by research councils, and understand the case for data preservation, not destruction, and various other reasons towards for moving towards open data. But I would say our focus on vulnerable and marginalised groups raises some concerns. Kind of barriers that we have might be informed consent wording that imposes a restriction on data sharing, might tie data to a specific purpose or set of outputs. We might not have permission for sharing data openly, even when it's de-identified, or specifically archiving, so that would need to be built into consent with the appropriate wording. Costs, we think it is very time consuming to anonymise particularly detailed narrative transcripts. So how do we cover those research time costs that are extra without funders be covering that? Low numbers, so subgroups can involve small population fractions, qual research can involve very small numbers of participants. So individual rights to confidentiality and privacy need to be respected, and those are particular challenges. And also I think there's a certain uncertainty when it comes to the level of detail in longer narrative text from interviews, and when that becomes disclosive, and I think we really need more guidance on that before we move forward. As both LSE and UKRI ethics guidelines emphasise, when taking under research with potentially vulnerable groups, there's risks of harm such as further discrimination or stigmatisation, or adverse welfare impacts, or exposure to hate crime or even violence when we undertake the research. And to mitigate against those risks, it's increasingly recognised as good practice to adopt research models of continuous active involvement of individuals' lived experience or representative groups. So, for example, the National Children's Bureau talks about the right of children and young people to active involvement in all stages of research that impacts on them. And LSE's ethics guidelines highlights nothing about me without me ethos when it comes to underrepresented groups. So just to illustrate some of that from my own research, I've been working recently on an ADR funded project which focuses on the circumstances and experiences and support needs of young people from the Gypsy, Traveller, Roma communities. This is joint work with Polina Oblenskaya. So this used a large scale linked data set called Growing Up in England. So a key advantage is that we were able to reach Gypsy, Traveller young people in a way that previously hasn't been possible using this data set, because the data set as a whole had 7 million individuals, and Gypsy, Traveller, Roma identifiers were included in the data set. But it is a secure data set, and it can only be used by trained researchers in trusted research environments, and it's subject to statistical disclosure checks. So ADR do encourage openness, for example, code sharing and production of synthetic data sets, but it's not open data as such, and there's a whole raft of legal and regulatory requirements around the use of that data. Our own project was referred to the National Statisticians Data Ethics Advisory Committee, who really emphasised Gypsy, Traveller young people as a potentially vulnerable group, and asked us to take specific mitigation measures from potential harms arising from the research. And that wasn't just the process of data gathering, but after the data was gathered and non-stigmatising write-up, that kind of thing. So in response, we adopted what we see as a good practice model of continuous involvement with a civil society organisation that represents and gives voice to Gypsy, Traveller, Roma people. And they were included in every stage, so planning, identification of research questions, aspects of research design, and also after we de-identified and gathered data, so interpreting findings, checking outputs, advising on language, cultural sensitivity, co-producing engagement workshops, ensuring appropriate communication of findings, so we produced accessible and culturally sensitive outputs such as a video and an infographic, and friends, family and travellers who were the organisation we worked with were very much working with us on that and ensuring feedback and communication with participants and generally with the communities in relation to the findings. Then with input from the LSE Research Ethics Committee, we also had a very careful process for obtaining informed consent and building up trust for the research exercise. So literacy can be a barrier in the communities. So we had a bespoke process for informed consent that did allow for oral consent if it was necessary. And we did put very clear and specific uses of the data for within our informed consent forms. So we specified what the outputs would be. The role of FFT was built in as part of the process for informed consent. They were on hand for any welfare issues. And generally, the informed consent process helped to build up trust in the research exercise in communities where such trust is often absent. So I suppose my main thoughts are really looking forward, if we get through with open data specifically and opening up data sets, we are looking forward in case to new generations of qualitative research and surveys, longitudinal qualitative surveys, and working with the library on the kind of ideas about depositing those transcripts and surveys. But if we get through issues around like disclosure and confidentiality and costs, I suppose I'm thinking the key challenge is how do we maintain true to those models of co-production and collaborative partnership and participation in research models, at the same time as opening up our research data in line with open data principles, and what kind of conditions and restrictions are there, or is this entirely open? Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Pauline. Timing, thanks a lot. Now is Mirafore, if you want to go ahead.
And thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. It is really interesting to hear about all the great stuff that people are doing. So my name is Marta Kakulitu. I am an early career academic researcher. I recently completed a 3-year postdoc in the RESTAR research program. So this is a 3.3 million UKRI funded program at King's College London. It is very collaborative, multidisciplinary, and is also in partnership with many other academic institutions, including UCL and Freud, and other great organizations. And I specialize generally in youth mental health and learning, and I'm working a lot both with neurotypical and neurodivergent populations, particularly autistic young people and those with ADHD, so groups which have been systematically overlooked in research. And if we look at research historically, there are many examples of research which have caused more harm than good, even if researchers had very good intentions most of the times. So in my research, I use a lot participatory research methodologies, working with experts by experience across all the phases of the research cycle, from the conceptualization of the research questions to the dissemination of findings. And this is to help improve the impact of translational science. For example, in the RESTAR research program, I worked a lot with my colleagues, neurodivergent young people across different stages and different studies. For example, in the interview projects that we did, we worked with neurodivergent young people during the co-design of the research questions. We had a lot of meetings for many months to conceptualize the topic of interest, which was the topic of emotions in the school environment. We also co-designed the interview schedule together. We co-designed interactive multimedia tools that we used as part of the interview schedules to elicit richer accounts from our participants. We also worked together to deliver the interviews, so that the interviews were delivered with a neurodivergent youth researcher and also an academic researcher. We analyzed the interviews together. We did the coding, the clustering of the codes, the generation of themes. Neurodivergent young people had regular training because we offer these opportunities, but at the same time, it is important to offer opportunities for them to develop skills so that they can contribute as valued members of the team. And we also shared findings in conferences. We also published together in open access and peer-reviewed journals. And neurodivergent young people had the opportunity, had the choice to either be named as a valued co-author or to be named as part of the, to be acknowledged as part of the broader Restart team. We also shared findings in different formats for different audiences, for example, through blogs, through podcasts, through public engagement events. We did 2 events in the Science Gallery London to share findings with young people, with families, school practitioners and clinicians. We also recently published a paper in the British Journal of Psychiatry where we outline the key preconditions and the challenges of doing participatory research with neurodivergent populations. And in our studies, we also try to publish the different steps and the processes that we followed to do the co-design of the studies, the data collection, the interview analysis. I think we can do quite better in terms of how we describe all these different processes, and especially when we adopt more traditional protocols of analysis, like when we do participatory research. It is also important to have a step-by-step guidance and showcase how we involved experts by experience. So some of the challenges, I think, one of the key challenges is that when it comes to qualitative research and open science, we really try to quantify this in some way. We try to apply quantitative standards. So we tend to store and share data for future application and reproducibility. However, these concepts are not very much in line with many qualitative paradigms. So in qualitative research, we really try to ensure the transparency and the rigor and the integrity. But replicating qualitative research can be very challenging because it is a very active and very dynamic process. The qualitative researchers bring their own expertise, their identities, multiple identities sometimes, the different skills, and all these things, the self that they bring in research will very much influence how they do the analysis. So there is that question as to whether it makes sense to share data without sharing also some contextualized information around that. So yeah, I would say that many qualitative researchers would say that open sciences can have many benefits, but at the same time there is some skepticism and there needs to be careful thinking and planning. Most importantly, because we don't really want to risk the trust and the relationships that we have been building with the communities. We do not want to cause more harm than we did in the past.
Thanks a lot. Thank you for this reflection as well. And finally, George, if you want to share your thoughts about this.
Thanks, Andrea, and all the speakers here, Joe, Puli, and Nato, and also all of you for coming. I'm George Kunnat. I'm an associate professor and academic lead for the Atlantic Fellows for Social and Economic Equity program. I'm based at the International Inequalities Institute at LSE. I'm an anthropologist, and what I'm going to share, my work is basically about conflict and peace building, and I look at the Maoist guerrilla movement in India, and also I do comparative research since last 4 years in Colombia, especially looking after the FARC went into the peace agreement. I look at the implementation of the gender commitments of the Colombian peace agreement. So since last 4 years I've been doing research there. What I want to share with you is also the transformation I as an anthropologist went through, working in India, especially living with Maoist guerrillas for my doctoral work for 1 year, and my postdoctoral research 18 months, living in the forest, looking at people, why do people join the guerrilla movement, and what happens to them, and how are the people who live in the midst of conflict, what are their everyday lives. So that was a kind of approach there. And then in Colombia, there is another transformation will take place, which I will share. It's about the way we do research. and the way we publish, the outputs and participation. So a transformation of the anthropologist in the context of different research, and as we age and the number of years, I think things keep changing also the way we look at realities. I like the catchy phrase coming to the talk today. I like the catchy phrase about research as open as possible, as closed as necessary. I thought it's very well put, and also it's there in the Horizon Europe page. I think it gives a space for context to shape what your research is, how open it should be, which is very good. But when it comes to making research among vulnerable communities or marginalized communities open, I think we need much more a nuanced understanding, and that nuanced understanding for me is within the framework of ethics, research ethics. So I'm more practice, I think my colleagues have shared very well about practice. I don't want to keep adding to it, but I want to look at more rationale of what could be the rationale or the philosophy that should lead to what open research is all about, or what closed research should be. So that's my my emphasis at the moment. So a more nuanced approach based on an ethical framework would have two dimensions. One is the code of ethics that all of us researchers we are familiar with. We give priority to, we fill these forms, and we give priority to research participants. A lot of aspects are dedicated to research participants, and that involve consent, that involves safeguarding their identities, their interests, and then also giving fair wages for their time. And then there is also a dimension of our responsibility towards institutions where we are based. Respecting those interests of the institutions, funders. So these are ways we kind of see our research. That's one aspect of the research. But when it comes to more living with the marginalized communities, they need to have a more specific way of looking at research ethics is about. Because the whole perspective here is we privilege the perspective of the marginalized communities, which means we are going beyond the concept of neutrality sometimes. Because we want to see neutrality, we know there is a problem. Neutrality always maintains status quo. It always favors status quo. And therefore, working with the marginalized communities and how that research should be made open will depend on that taking sides, privileging the marginalized communities. So anthropologists have gone, part of their research methodology from rapport building was a kind of the big thing. Clifford Geertz will say, the whole thing about anthropology is about building rapport. That's not enough. We need to go beyond into that which shapes, that relationship that shapes field and the desk. You are there in the field doing research, and when you are back in your research institutions, you are writing. And that writing will be shaped by your relationship in the field. Because there, as a researcher there, you undergo multiplex identities, like Renato Rosaldo would talk about it. You are an insider to some, and to same people you are an outsider. To some others in the same field you are an outsider. When you are in a Maoist context, when I am there, I am with the Dalit communities living there, they make you an insider depending on your shared values. It's not about being native or non-native, but it's about shared values that make you insider and outsider. All this is going to have an impact the way you have that relationship between field and the desk when you start writing for publication. So that's one aspect of it. Second one is, like, you can't be neutral on a moving train. That is by Howard Zinn's famous book. And that sort of this is where the taking sides becomes crucial. And what the impact of taking sides, I will come to that later. So privileging the marginalized perspective, and the question of neutrality, and that will come up. Then what I found impressive is, as a participant observer, you go to places where otherwise you prefer not to go. And once you are there, you are, in a way, what you are doing is an act of witnessing, which has got its moral and theological character. It's not me saying, it is Nancy Shepard who's saying, but something I have kind of thought it is very true. That act of witnessing, and once you have witnessed it, you want to draw others into that act of witnessing. And that's where the writing comes. That's where making the research, what you learn in the field to be shared with the people comes very strongly. Now, what I've learned over the years, I will come very quickly to. How many minutes?
I guess we have 1 minute stop.
1 minute, thank you. You're very generous. You could have said also 1 second. Now, what exactly in this whole process of making research open, that will be determined by how your research becomes non-extractive. A lot of when we were young doing research felt like, at least in my case, I'm not speaking for others, it was all about publishing. You collect data, you bring and you publish, single-authored. Anthropology has this emphasis on single-authored work. And then you gradually realize the more if you want to have participation of your research participants, then your research has to be non-extractive. And what does non-extractive research would mean? Where our own research becomes a space for methodologies become transformative methodologies, where fieldwork becomes a site of capacity building. And this is what, in India, I never thought of these aspects when I was doing research. But in Colombia, there was a challenge, a demand. What do you bring? What do you bring to our lives? And therefore, the entire research methodology in the last 3-4 years that I've been working there is about how that place becomes transformative. So this is one challenge I felt. And I also realized that the need for co-authored works with the research participants. This might bring us into conflict with our own academic promotions, our own tenure, all that, maybe at a different age, once you are more settled and you've got a permanent job, things might change. That's why I said the transformation of the anthropologist takes in the process of this changing approach to how do we make our research open. So collaborative research, authorship, I'm writing a book with the 5 FARC combatants now, looking at FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. So this whole non-extractive research, and the people become, one who open up the research they have to be the one, their voices to come up, and they should become authors of their own voices. That to me, at the moment, at this stage of my life, that's the most significant part of making research open. Now,
George, if I can stop you there, just for the sake of, I think, gathering as many questions as possible, and I think some of these may come up in the Q&A. So thank you so much to the panelists for this very interesting discussion. I would like to exploit the privilege of a chair and ask the first question, and then I will be gathering questions from the audience. I thought this was great, and I've been thinking about open research, and I think open research is a great term because it encompasses a number of ways or meanings of openness in science, right? And I've listed 4 different ways you have been speaking about openness, and surely there are many more ways, and please fill in on this list. But just for the sake of discussion, you have discussed the open access publication and how these reach out to a wider audience than just colleagues. You have discussed public outreach as when research is turned into kind of exhibition for the general public. You have discussed open methodologies, which I think is really interesting, how we inform our colleagues of the way we try to build a rapport and methods of research that are not extractive, or they can bring in new communities under the gaze of the social sciences. Then there is also the discussion of open data, which we started off this discussion with, the idea that we want to publish the data that we produce with our research, because we believe that these may be informative or generative for the general public and for citizen scientists who may have access to the raw data of science in a way that may be transformational as well, right? One example in anthropology that is recent is Robert Borowski, who is a public anthropologist. He's had the Center for Public Anthropology. I think it's in Boston, if I remember correctly. He recently published an index version of all his field notes from 30 years of fieldwork in Papua New Guinea and in the Pacific. And this was done in collaboration with the chiefs and leaders of the community he researched in, because he believed publishing online would be educational for the children of his own research interlocutors, who may learn about their own culture historically by relying on these data. And I thought this was an amazing idea to think with. I mean, that opening our diaries to, the next generation of our research interlocutors could be also transformational for them. So my question is, where you draw the line on openness? Of these, four ways of discussing openness, there might be open version of research that you accept, and other version of openness that you refuse, or because of ethics, or because of practicalities, or because of responsibilities that you think you have. So where you draw the line, and what is the rationale for having openness to begin with, right? Why would, as anthropologists and social scientists, may want to open as much as possible our research to others? This is for everyone, so, who is, courageous enough to tackle this?
We can go and...
Joe, you want to start?
Yeah, start. That was the question. So where I draw the line, so all the data that I had collected for my PhD has always been accessible and open to the sex working community already. Now I work with 180,000 women with a national network of sex workers, which works in 8 states in India. So within the community itself, everything that I've done with them has always been participatory, and they have access to all my work. So everything I put into the thesis as well, we had one-on-one conversations on, is this okay to put? You had told me this 2 years ago. Is that still okay? Is that still relevant? So that's that part of it. I did not and don't want to at the moment open it up to people outside of the sex working community, unfortunately, because that is something that has been asked of me by the sex working community, because there are not only safety factors to keep in mind, but also the fact that sex workers have been extracted from over years and years, and for them, they have a very specific practice of making outsiders insiders, and I cannot be the one coming in between and expecting that trust to happen in any other way other than the way that they mention it for themselves. One other thing that I did was in my PhD thesis, I use a lot of life narratives, and all of that has been put without editing verbatim, exactly the way it is, just translated. And the translations were all done by, the Malayalam translations, my mother tongue, were done by my mother. So that made her a sex worker positive feminist from just a feminist. And that's really sweet, because I felt like that was one way for me to also open my research to peers. I did a lot of my work for my peers, not for the sex workers that I work with, because it's my peers that don't understand a lot of what the sex workers are talking about. Sex workers know where they are and what they are and everything. So translation was one way to open that out. It was to a small group of people. It was just 5-6 people who translated with me, but these were my friends who translated 8 different languages into English, and that was one way I could do that openness. But maybe in 2 years there will be other methods. So yeah.
Right, thank you.
Yeah, so in the project that we were previously discussing, we didn't archive our qualitative transcripts, and I suppose the reasons for that were the reasons that I was talking about. We didn't have informed consent that would have supported that, so that was definite red flag. Additionally, we're concerned about low numbers, so how do we respect individual privacy and confidentiality? And I think we have got a high level of uncertainty that needs to be resolved about norms around transcripts, qualitative transcripts, the level of detail and when they become disclosive. So I think we would like to move forward and archive qualitative interview scripts, but I think we're looking for more guidance before we would be in a position to do that.
Right.
Yeah, so at the moment, when it comes to sharing, we're not sharing recordings from the interviews with young people because my work primarily involves working with youth populations. We're also not sharing even anonymized data sets. So in the interviews that we were doing, many young people would have also mental health challenges such as depression or burnout. They would talk about very sensitive and very challenging experience that they have in school or outside school. We got parental and young person consent. However, we felt that we shouldn't really publish this data even anonymized. And even with anonymization, some participants can still be identified in some way. So we really also need to take this into account. And also with young person consent, even if we have their consent for that particular time to share data, things might change in 5 years or 10 years from now. So if we really want to use this data, for example, in future secondary analysis, we need to provide all this necessary information that people need to make an informed choice. And I guess I still feel there might be some constraints there because how do we communicate information about future use when we ourselves may not have a very good understanding of how this data will be used and for what purposes. And also the other practical challenge is that qualitative data analysis takes so much time. It can be very burdensome, and in big funded projects you might have allocated budget to go through a third company do the transcription, but very often researchers will not have access to these services, so they need to do the data collection and the analysis themselves. So we also need to think what is the available infrastructure because it requires time and human power. Who is going to do all this analysis? Who is going to do the anonymization? And we need to decide what kind of data makes sense to share. For example, in quantitative research, we're not expecting quantitative researchers to share everything, all the kind of analysis. So what kind of data makes sense to share?
Yeah, that's a great.
Since my context is a context of insurgency and counterinsurgency, it becomes data is the most dangerous thing. When you come out of the field side, carrying data is, because it's also a counterinsurgency place. So therefore, a lot of times, not even writing as you conducting an interview, but memorizing as much as possible and then write it down after you have time. So that was one thing. So I cannot see myself sharing the data from the field because of the fact that easily people you can anonymize people, but you can still identify, That's how it is in anthropological research. There is always that threat. So therefore, that burden of knowing and responsibility for knowledge, this is something that wages on you every time you come out of the field site. And when it is finally written down and secured, I think it should not be, I find it very difficult to share at the moment because another person, another set of people who are handling the data set may not know exactly what is the context of this research is, So therefore that becomes problematic.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for your responses. Now we have 5 minutes, I guess, more or less. Maybe we can take a few questions from the audience, and we collect those questions and then we try to address them. Okay? Do you want the microphone? Yeah.
Marcus, if you
You can speak. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, my name is Kevin Loheng. I'm an AI ethics researcher at Northeastern. So last year, I got really fed up doing my line of research. I was tired of being in a lab, and I felt like I wanted to do some research that would bring me closer to humans and people. And in response to that impetus within me, I decided I'd spend 3 weeks in São Tomé and Príncipe. So it's the volcanic islands in West Africa where my parents are from. And I decided I would spend 3 weeks there with the communities who live in plantations. And I wanted to understand a bit about how, I guess, colonial legacies still affected their self-identity. And I carried out interviews, got transcripts, recorded the footage for the documentary that I wanted to do for this ethnography. And since returning, I felt almost overwhelmed, as this individual researcher with all of this, content in my hard drive, people's stories, people's lives, and I felt almost like unable to really dive into that research and give it the full-time commitment that it requires. And it's still heavy on my mind, and I want to carry out this research because it's very important, and most of it's already, I guess, part done, but now it's just about publishing or I guess next steps really. So I just wanted to open up the question to you guys for some advice on how what you would suggest for myself wanting to tackle this research project.
Thanks a lot. Before we get to address this question, anyone else wants to raise a question to the panelists? Yes, please.
So me.
Yes.
Hi. So I'm Lynn Grove, and I work with the Research Ethics Committee here at LSE. And the question I wanted to pose was that as an institution, we have a very high volume of master's research. It's done every year. But most master's research probably doesn't go further than the dissertation, which is examination material, and it's not published. So how do we square that with the need to not be extractive? Because in a lot of your cases, you're doing wonderful work where you're doing anthropological work or ethnography and working, building that trust with communities. But in master's level research, there isn't the kind of time frame for that. So how do we kind of reconcile that, sort of encouraging that master's level research, but actually, is that really the best way of doing that research?
Right, that's another great question. So maybe you last one, and then yes, sorry.
I wanted to ask a question about how you deal with the messiness. So you talked about, for example, sex workers that you work with 180,000 of them. I'm assuming they all have different perspectives of how the research should take place. A lot of you have experience of partnering with organizations. The selection of the organizations that you're partnering with, how did that take place? And if people within the organizations are disagreeing with how the research should be done and used, how do you cope with those messy moments?
So we have these three questions, and I wonder whether we are able to tackle all the three of them. So can we start from the gentleman, whether someone can address this question about what to do with all this wealth of material?
Well, I suppose that's a real case for an archive where data can be deposited with the relevant permissions, and as long as all the relevant consents. So that's definitely a case for open data. I'm sorry, I don't know, but you could talk to UK Data Archive or maybe the LSE Library about potential for depositing that data. But it did make me reflect on AI generally. I mean, this is one of the reservations that that data could be used by AI, or AI and large language models could be used to analyse qualitative research. So if we're archiving material, it's another case for are we happy with that? Are we opening up all our interviews and transcripts to AI models, and what restrictions should be put on there?
Kevin, can I come to your question? I wish we know how to produce and write what we collected data. We should be publishing books now. This is the real dilemma all of us go through, the struggle of writing down A lot of anthropologists love fieldwork. I love fieldwork, you know. But when it comes back to write, that the discipline just don't have the discipline to do that. So this I suffer from. But I'm just wondering whether you would, like for example, if you have a way of bringing your research participants into co-authoring with you something, whether that would give you a different motivation, a new inspiration, because it's not just you, but they are also being represented as co-authors. You know.
Can we tackle the master research ethics question and extractivism, if anyone has thoughts about that?
I know I too supervise a lot of master's degree students, and I also sit on their ethics committees, and I'm just wondering whether that could be with the permission, whether it can be, these theses could be made available for others who want to work on it, of course with their consent, you know. It's like when we submit our PhD thesis, I remember at SOAS, one copy was sent to British Library, and then you would write down and say, okay, I consent that people can. But at that time, I said no, because of the fact that mine was quite, dangerous kind of research. But maybe, I don't know, possibility of making research available with their consent here.
I suppose another idea might be, just building on the ADR, it's not possible for every administrative data project to have its own engagement exercise. All the PhDs and all the fellows, but there's a broader kind of ADR level engagement that goes on around attitudes towards data use or engagement with particular groups. So maybe that's something LSE could be doing at an institutional level, or there could be departmental engagement exercises that are going on that students could learn about and have insights from and feed into.
2 minutes for messiness.
Yes. So I mean, the only way for me to deal with messiness is to get dirty and not pretend like it doesn't exist. Because yes, we work with extremely messy topics, lots of things are happening. And that's why I was talking about making those structures visible rather than pretending like nothing happened on field and everything went exactly how you expected it to be. Kevin, one thing I wanted to say is every time I feel like I don't know what to write or that I'm not able to write, I realize that maybe writing is not what I should be doing at that moment. There is another way to deal with that. And the thing about the master's thing, I thought, well, one way is a lot of master's students do literature reviews as part of their dissertations, right? So those dissertations could involve things that are not just academic work, because a lot of communities publish, but they do so on Medium blogs and Substack and Reddit threads and things like that. So maybe we can be looking at that instead of only academic articles and be listening to the communities.